Greetings and salutations, friends. So, it's been a bit of a hectic week, and it's going to remain a little bit hectic, so the pace of the lore videos will probably slow down a little bit. I'll do my best to get you, well, two of them, the lore and the army video, once a week, but as to the schedule, I cannot really guarantee anything. But that little update aside, the next one we have up here is the Lizardmen of Lustria. Now, the Lizardmen are a bit of a problematic race to do a lore video for, simply because while they technically have quite a lot of lore, they have been redesigned so many times that it's kinda hard, even for someone like myself who's read most of their lore and has conducted a fair bit of research before even beginning this video, to actually be able to tell what you could consider canon and what you might consider ancient history, I suppose. Because the Lizardmen started out kind of like an Indian type faction, like they had feather hairdress and all of that stuff. They were a Native American faction kinda, except, you know, lizards. But these days they've evolved, I suppose you could say, into much more of an... well, they combine parts of Aztec, Inca, and Mayan mythology and religious practices, and even some of their forms of warfare. Now, for not that long ago, the warriors of the Lizardmen were divided into several sub-clans. They were called, like, Jaguar warriors, Eagle warriors, a la the Aztec style. This appears to no longer be the case, so basically, I'm going to be basing this lore video off the latest army book and the latest source of fluff, so if you came expecting dinosaur Indians, you are sadly going to be somewhat disappointed. And where the fluff fails, I'm essentially going to be making my own little leaps of judgment. I feel I've got good enough of a feel for the Warhammer worlds to be able to fill in at least some of the blanks. We'll start out with the most obvious part. Exactly where in the Warhammer worlds are the Lizardmen actually located? Well, they are located far to the southwest of the Warhammer world, in what would in our modern day be essentially South America. They inhabit massive steaming jungles filled with all kinds of vicious predators and deadly diseases that are pretty damn inhospitable to anyone but the Lizardmen and the hardiest of all the world races. And while there are several colonies of other races along the coasts of Lustria, the Lizardmen usually do not appreciate strangers visiting their lands for any length of time, and usually set upon them with giant-ass clubs made of bronze in an effort to persuade them to fuck the hell off. The legendary hospitality of the Lizardmen notwithstanding, there are plenty of willing adventurers that continuously raid into the jungles of Lustria in search for the Lizardmen's massive temple cities, which are dotted across the continent, simply because the vast majority of these cities, those who haven't been abandoned or completely looted, are filled with all manners of magical trinkets and, easier to distinguish, gold. Absolute tons of it, as gold was essentially the preferred material by the Lizardmen. They used gold for pretty much all of their magical trinkets. They used gold in much of their decorations. They used gold as dinner plates. They used gold as utensils. They use it for pretty much anything. And so any party of adventurers that actually manages to get into a Lizardman city without getting eaten by the local wildlife or the Lizardmen have plenty of stuff just literally lying out on the ground that they could pick up and make away with. Of course, if they manage to survive the jungle one way, there is absolutely no guarantee that they're going to be surviving the jungle the way back again, especially not as the Lizardmen do not take too kindly to intruders and usually dispatch an army after them to suitably chastise them. As for the lay of the land, you've essentially got the choice between steaming jungles filled with all manners of angry critters, and a wide and fascinating array of diseases, or wild, inhospitable mountaintops, where you might be getting away from quite a few of the diseases, but, well, let's just say that the local wildlife is still rather feisty. And to make matters worse, predatory animals, diseases, and a considerable amount of poisonous snakes are not the only dangers to set upon would-be adventurers. The Skaven clan pestilence has taken up a fair bit of a residence in Lustria themselves, and the Skaven of Lustria are no less hostile to the man-things than their old-world brethren. Or if you're particularly unlucky, you might be caught by the undead pirates that roam the vampire coasts. Led by a particularly vicious and insane vampire, they are a rather aggressive bunch. Additionally, you've got to watch out for all manners of living pirates who are, well, while slightly more merciful than the undead, they're still in all due likelihood going to, well, kill you and steal all of your stuff. And if you're particularly unlucky, you might even run into some of the Dark Elves that routinely travel down the coasts of Lustria before making the skip over to Araby. And while your life is probably going to be reasonably safe in the hands of the Dark Elves, I can pretty much guarantee that after a few weeks aboard a Dark Elf ship, you'll start hoping that it was the vampires and the undead that caught you instead. As for their origins story, well, it's a little bit of a complicated issue, really, but I'll try to shed some light on it for you. Now, the Lizardmen, along with pretty much all the other races, were originally brought to the Warhammer world by the enigmatic Old Ones. What the Old Ones are, or were for that matter, is a matter of some debate. Many argue that they were probably the Old Ones of Warhammer 40k, which also had a race of Old Ones who was said to have invented most of the races, actually presiding upon the world. And it's pretty easy to think that the Old Ones might be the same guys, simply because some of the races they created in the Warhammer world have certain similarities with the ones that were created in 40k. The alternative idea is, of course, that the Old Ones were gods. Now, this theory is a fair bit thinner, simply because the vast majority of the Lizardmen gods do not appear to have any real power. Now, if they were chaos gods, their power would be able to materialize in some basic form, but that does not seem to be the case. The only Lizardman god that seems to be able to actually do, god things is Sotek, the serpent god, who appears to be able to change the great plan of the Old Ones, and I'll get to what the great plan is in a moment. But essentially, the only one who actually seems to be able to affect things is Sotek, which again brings up the question, if the other Old Ones are gods, why are they not doing anything? It's not like the Slans don't expect them to. The Slan wants them to, because the Slan are trying to decipher the Great Plan, continuously praying for guidance, hints, and signs, and that kind of stuff, so you would reason that were they proper Chaos Gods, they would probably be some sort of reply. Because as with Sotek, he did reply, and he had an effect on the old world, so that one's a bit hard. I can't really go with one or the other. Personally, I prefer the theory that they are the Old Ones of 40k, simply because that would explain a lot of the inconsistencies with their apparent lack of godly powers. And it would also allow you to explain Sotek relatively easily, as at this point the Slans have been praying for guidance for literally thousands upon thousands of years and had no response. Well, eventually the amount of feelings, of energy, of passion, the quest of the Lizardmen, so to say, of the Slan mage priests, are going to have an actual effect upon the warp, and therefore might very easily have borne fruit in the form of Sotek. Now, after hearing the name Sotek this many times, you're probably starting to wonder who the hell was he, or more correctly, what was he? And, well, that's a little bit of a complicated question. Because here's the thing. While I've originally called Sotek a chaos god, and I still kind of believe he might be, there was actually a prophecy of Sotek written down on one of the many plaques that the Islam read for hints about the future of the Great Plan. However, the vast majority of the Slan mage priests considered it to be erroneous. They considered it to be insubstantial. It was merely one plaque hinting towards this apocalyptic end of Lizardmen. They considered it impossible. And the only ones who actually really took it seriously in any way were the skink priests. And they didn't dare to actually try and bring this into the light because, well, they were merely skinks. How could they possibly know better than the Great Slan? And as such, the prophecy of Sotek remained more or less ignored until the time of his predicted apocalypse actually came upon them. And their apocalypse took a rather unusual form, as it landed on the shores of Lustra in ramshackle boats, floating carcasses of sea creatures and whatever else could be made seaworthy. It was the Skaven clan Pestilence. And while at first their numbers were decimated by the wide variety of interesting, fascinating, and downright horrifying diseases of the lands of Lustria, they very, very quickly adapted to their surroundings and became the clan Pestilence we know today. And as with all Skavens, they bred extremely quickly, to the point where a seemingly minor event that the Lizardmen as a whole considered little more than a distraction. They saw the Skaven as an abhorrence in the Great Plan, but not anything with any real significance. They figured they would either just melt into the jungle and become one of the many species of dangerous creatures roaming the lands, or the very land itself would kill them with its diseases and its predators. But they severely underestimated Clan Pestilence, who very soon grew to dominate vast stretches of jungle, and when the Lizardmen finally realized the danger and tried to drive them off, they weren't able to. Vast hosts of Lizardmen were organized to fight the Skavens in titanic battles that raged for days at a time, with thousands upon thousands of Lizardmen and tens of thousands of Skaven dying in every last one. But while the Skaven can keep up with that rate of attrition, the Lizardmen cannot. While the Lizardmen are able to spawn essentially infinite numbers of warriors, they need time. Every spawning takes months, if not years. If they had been properly prepared for the coming apocalypse, they could have met the Skaven ratmen in innumerable hordes, but they weren't. And so, caught on the back foot, many prominent Lizardmen cities fell to the tides of Skaven, overrun by sheer virtue of numbers, and the disturbing fact that the Skaven had managed something that even the jungles of Lustra had not yet managed. They had created diseases of such power and virulence that they actually managed to infect the Lizardmen. And even whenever they managed to capture a city, they managed to infect the sacred spawning pools of the Lizardmen with diseases of such potency that no further Lizardmen could ever have been spawned from them. And yet, even now, the Slan mage priests did not take the threat seriously. They continued to look for other reasons for why this was happening, continuing to ignore the prophecy of Sotek. However, in pretty much the only case of more or less open rebellion in the Lizardman society, the skink priests decided that they could no longer stand idly by, and began carrying out ritualistic sacrifices in the name of Sotek. And though even these efforts came far too late to save some of the grandest Lizardmen cities, their sacrifices proved finally that the prophecy of Sotek had some validity, and forced the Slans to finally take it into consideration. And while hundreds, if not thousands, more of the Lizardmen were to die in the throes of pestilence while the mage priests convened and discussed the prophecy, they finally took action and sent the Lizardmen out to capture as many Skavens as they could get their clawed hands on. And in a grand ritual they sacrificed thousands of Skavens to Sotek, which finally brought the prophecy of Sotek into its full being, with a spawning of sacred skinks of Sotek. These skinks were quite unlike the normal race of skinks, as they were far, far more ferocious, preferring melee combat rather than the skirmishing tactics of their normal skink brethrens. Additionally, they were spawned with great red crests on their heads rather than the normal membranes of their lesser skink brothers. They were also considerably larger than your average skink, although still nowhere near the size of stature of Sora's warriors. But perhaps their greatest advantage was the simple fact that while the normal Lizardmen were falling in the thousands to the Skaven plagues, the skinks of Sotek appeared near immune to the plagues of clan pestilence, and so were able to fight them far more effectively than they had been previously. And really, this is where the interesting part is, because Sotek was not able to do anything until he received mass amounts of sacrifices, until he started to receive general worship by the Lizardmen, at which point you've got to ask yourself, was this really the prophecy of some lost old one, despite the fact that it had been discounted by the vast majority, if not all, of the slain mage priests? Or was it the simple act of sacrifice that brought him into being as a chaos god? And while I personally favor the Chaos God theory, we can't really say for certain. All we do know is that with these new spawnings in great numbers, and with their newfound immunity to the plagues of clan pestilence, the skinks finally managed to start beating the Skaven in open battles, in titanic battles that sometimes raged for weeks at a time. The Skavens were finally driven back into their strongholds, where, from below their very tunnels that they called home, they were set upon by incredible numbers of serpents, the favoured beings of Sotek, and driven out of their lairs, till one final massive battle, where the Skavens were finally forced away from Lustria proper. And while many of Clan Pestilence did manage to escape this final destruction, some of them returning to the old world, and some of them taking up residence on the islands outside of Lustria, they had finally been driven off, and the doom of the Lizardmen had been prevented. And while the Lizardmen accepted this as the actions of one of the Old Ones, we, who are more knowledgeable about the Warhammer universe, might begin to question, was this really some long-lost prophecy? Or was this the power of the warp, influencing the world yet again, in ways that might not be evil, although it has to be said that Sotek requires far more blood sacrifice than any of the other Old Ones ever required? He did save Lustria, he did save the Lizardmen, and while he is a fairly belligerent god calling for the conquest of the rest of the world, not only the eradication of the Lizardmen, he's clearly not a chaos god in the purest, evilest, most chaotic sense. So, for the moment, I think we're going to stick to the general theory that the Lizardmen were created by the Old Ones. Now, why were they created? Well, here's where we arrive at the Great Plan. According to the Slan, the Old Ones had some kind of grand scheme for not only their world, but the universe in general, lending further credence to the 40k Old Ones theory. Problem is, the Slans don't actually know what this Great Plan is. They have some cryptic hints, they have several magical items, plaques of writing, basic instructions, this kind of things. The problem is, a lot of it is contradictory. And the vast majority of it, well, in fact, all of it, is not in any form of plain speech. To take an example, the first times the High Elves arrived in Lustria, the Lizardmen attacked them. At once, no hesitation, because they had decided that according to the Great Plan, the High Elves weren't supposed to be in Lustria. It was that simple, and that was all they needed to assault and butcher them. But at later dates, they have allowed High Elves not only to come to Lustria, but to settle in Lustria. They have let other races establish more or less permanent outposts in Lustria, in sharp contrast to their original and rather aggressive acts. And so, while they are most certainly the oldest race in the Warhammer world, they don't really have the wisdom one might assume. You might think that because the Slan mage priests are some of the best mages in the game, and they most certainly are, that they are just these incredibly sage and wise rulers. But this isn't really the case. They are far more of a priesthood than they are a governing body, and as most priesthoods, well, they have their own little dogma which they follow, and as such, a Slan mage priest is not so much intelligent, I suppose I could say, as he acts very robotically. It's quite easy to hear the name Lizardmen, watch a few art pieces of them in their great temple cities, and think, oh, they're just, an Aztec culture. They're kinda like humans, but they're lizards. But this is grossly misleading. The Lizardmen are far closer to semi-intelligent automatons than they are humans, or indeed most living beings. Now, that might come across as a pretty ridiculous slander against religion in general, but basically, you can imagine how fanatical religions are in our world with no real concrete proof. And then you imagine a world like the Warhammer world, where the Slans know for a fact that the old ones were a thing. They have the relics to prove it. They have the history to prove it. They even have an item, a magical item, one of the Lizardmen's most prized possessions, that occasionally still allows them to communicate in extremely cryptic and very, very bullshitty and misleading ways, but they can occasionally communicate with the old ones. And as such, they view their faith, I suppose you could call it, less as a faith, so to say, and more as, well, instructions. You could compare it to a proper religious fanatic of, for example, Christianity, who doesn't consider the Bible to be a gathering of metaphors or basic rules to live by. Hints and vague guidelines towards being a better person, and rather accepts it all as pure fact. Noah was a person, and he built a giant-ass boat, and he shoved 2 of every single goddamn animal on the bloody planet onto this boat, and he floated off to sea. And this leads to the Slan mage priests governing their realm in an extremely strict and conformative fashion. There is essentially no technology within the Lizardmen Empire, because, well, they don't really believe in it. They are wholly convinced that if they actually needed any of this technology, then surely the old ones would have already given it to them. Like the good old quote from our own world, if God wanted men to fly, he would have given us wings. But therein, of course, also lies the problem. While if you had a book like the Bible with some relatively specific stories in it of, there's only metaphors in the Bible if you look for them. Okay, that's not completely correct, but you get my general drift here. Whereas the great plan of the old ones, well, it's not even metaphors. It's nothing but clues and riddles and convoluted meaning, and very often it contradicts itself. There might be one plaque describing the great plan where the Lizardmen are supposed to rise up of their jungle homeland and go conquer the entire world, and so bring order to it. But at the same time, there's another plaque that says that the Lizardmen are forbidden from ever leaving Lustria. And this often contradictive nature has led them to have a bit of a reputation amongst the other races. The vast majority of other civilized races essentially consider the Lizardmen to be, well, part animals and part batshit insane monsters. They don't really consider them a civilized nation. They view them much in the same way that they view the monsters of the land. They consider beastmen and orcs to be pretty much the same as lizardmen. They are natural hazards rather than, a nation, and they very much so are a nation, despite not being a nation in human terms. Now, that got complicated really quick, so let me explain the basics of Lizardman society real quick. Lizardmen have no system of economy, so to say. Their workers do not get paid. They are born and bred to do their task, they do their task, and they never ask for more. The subspecies of lizardmen are born into servitude, complete and utter servitude. They never question why they are, bound in such a way. A skink will never question why he was born to be an artisan. A saurus will never question why he was born to be a soldier. And they will never at any point actually start questioning the Slan mage priests, who hold kind of a hive-mindish influence over them. In essence, only the Slans themselves are conscious, autonomous beings, capable of free thought, although they fairly rarely actually exercise it. They usually use all of their considerable intelligence simply to, study the great plan and try and figure out what it is they're supposed to be doing at any given time. And this quest to understand the great plan takes precedence over anything and everything. The Lizardmen could have a raiding warband of humans, for example, who just broke into one of their temple cities and stole some incalculably precious item. They could have them surrounded, dead to rights. And if one of the Slan mage priests leading the army decides that he sees something that might be a stein in a drizzle of sand or in the swishing of leaves, he's going to call off the entire battle. He's literally going to order his entire army to just stand down and ignore the humans until he's done figuring out what that breath of air meant, or what that movement of sand meant. And you might be thinking right now that that sounds pretty goddamn insane, and yes it is. The Slan mage priests, for all their incredible intelligence, are, batshit insane. And that's kind of the point. They are meant to illustrate, essentially, what could happen to a society that just gives up all pretense of free thinking, all pretense of individuality, and just devote themselves entirely to one cause, in this case, the Great Plan, which has become essentially a religion to Lizardmen. And as such, it is kind of understandable that all of the other civilized races view them as, just simple monsters. And as such, the Lizardmen cities and holy places are under more or less constant threat of being raided by adventurers and treasure hunters because, they don't know what they're dealing with, to be honest. They don't really know that they're dealing with a massive, incredibly powerful and well-organized hive mind that could call upon thousands of Saurus warriors, and will travel to hell and back to retrieve whatever magical trinkets the adventurers might want to make off with, simply because, while they could do all these things, more often than not, the Slans are too busy contemplating a ripple of water in a puddle somewhere, rather than actually giving a shit about the adventurers that are looting their temple. Although, mind you, they most certainly pay attention to that stuff quite a lot of the time as well. Being a temple robber in Lustria is by no means a safe occupation. And so, of course, you can imagine that, well, there is no Slan politics. The Slans are united in one single direction. Well, united is a strong word. They will argue for literally years about the subtleties of the Great Plan, but they're all agreeing upon the fact that, well, they should serve the Great Plan. But, as well, a lot of them consider all of the other races to be a mistake, and the few of them that don't, well, Lizardmen diplomacy kind of exists. Like, there has been some basic attempts, either from the civilized races or from the Lizardmen, to actually communicate with the outside world, but, well, Lizardmen diplomacy can best be described as a process consisting of a combination of random number generator.org, blindfolds, darts, and a Ouija board. And therefore, well, any diplomatic talks usually don't actually get anywhere. And due to that, they have, well, essentially no diplomatic relations with, well, anyone. The closest thing they've got to diplomatic relations is essentially with the High Elves. The High Elves have basically gotten the hint that they should stay out of Lustria to avoid getting eaten by, dinosaurs. And that's about the most complicated piece of diplomacy they've actually done, so that might be a bit of an issue in a Total War game, considering they would essentially be at war with everyone at all times, because the vast majority of the civilized races just consider them monsters, and so if they suddenly started traveling across the world and spreading their newfangled religion, well, they're probably not going to be accepted, well, anywhere, essentially. And again, considering that they pretty much can never actually agree upon one actual set of actions, like, you'd have to do some kind of fluff stuff that says that the old ones suddenly hit them up on the magical space telephone and went, yeah, you know that whole conquer the world thing? Yeah, go with that one for the time being. And yeah, kinda, but even then, it's not really diplomacy, it's just, well, the Lizardmen decided to launch a crusade, essentially. Now, enough rambling about that. I'm starting to ramble myself into circles on that, so let's try and move on to the actual Lizardmen themselves. The ruling class of the Lizardmen in this, well, essentially theocracy, are the Slan Mage Priests. Now, the Slans were the very first creations of the Old Ones, their favored servants. They are massive, bloated, toad-like things, with an incredible command of magic, but physically extremely weak. Slans are essentially immortal. No one's died of old age yet over all of the thousands of years, so you can pretty much guarantee that they're not going to start dropping dead over aging anytime soon, and can spend centuries in meditation. Literally, they will contemplate a movement of grass as a sign from the Old Ones for hundreds of years. And as you can imagine, this kind of mindless devotion doesn't leave room for much of a sex life, and the Slans, well, they can't reproduce. And that's not just because they shut themselves up in their rooms all day, contemplating the finer points of grass movement, but because they simply weren't created with any sort of reproductive system. On the upside, though, the Slans are so ridiculously magical powerful that their spirits can linger on beyond the death of their body, so you can kill a Slan, but if he is bound inside, well, either his corpse or some form of magical vessel, he's still technically alive, and he still maintains pretty much all of his commands over magic, and he retains the vast majority of his intelligence, if not all of it. And this of course means that you have quite a lot of slans of different ages. You have essentially the original slans, the original servants of the old ones are literally millennia old, and most of them are dead, but, well, a few of them are kept alive, more or less, by having their souls bound to their mummified corpse. And even a young Slan is hundreds upon hundreds of years old, and is more than a match for the most powerful wizards of pretty much any other race, including the High Elves, so yeah, they're pretty damn good at that stuff. And while I do call them the ruling caste, well, like I said, they usually just shut themselves up in their rooms, meditating for hundreds of years, only waking up for short periods of times to, well, give some basic instructions. And so they're not much for bureaucracy, which is handy because, well, the Lizardmen don't really have any bureaucracy. They don't really run their empire, so to say. It kind of just takes care of itself. And the reason for that is the three subspecies, or, well, subspecies is kind of wrong. The Lizardmen are essentially a confederacy of 4 different species, where the Slan Mage Priests are the, well, ruling priest class of this theocracy. Then you've got the Skinks. The Skinks are the artisans and the lesser priests, the functionaries of the Lizardman kingdom. They're the ones that clean and maintain the temple cities, and make sure that the Sauruses and Kroxigors get their usual meals. And they carry out most of the minor religious ceremonies, the sacrificial offerings of various intruders and animals, etc. Stuff that's really beneath the Slans themselves. And they do these tasks not because they've been told to or because they've been trained to. They've literally been programmed to carry out their tasks since birth. Since their spawning, a skink priest has always been programmed to be a skink priest. And while they can have some flexibility in their tasks, for example, the vast majority of skinks are also the first line of defense for the temple cities, being employed as skirmishers and scouts. And many of the skink priests also do take part inside the Lizardman army as priests, minor spellcasters, and characters. But even these things are simple programs. They're not so much birthed as they are built, or bioengineered, I suppose would be the correct term. And the same holds true for their larger cousins, the Saurus warriors. The Saurus are, well, the soldier class, essentially. They have very little tasks within Lizardman society other than being guards and warriors. They're pretty damn stupid because, well, brain capacity is not one of the primary focuses of any would-be Sauros soldier. However, again, they are born pre-programmed with a basic understanding of fighting. From birth, they understand how to use their weapons, they understand how to block with their shields. And while they occasionally get overwhelmed by a good old bestial instinct in close combat and decide to start eating their foes rather than beating them to death with bronze clubs, the majority of the time they are capable of holding formation relatively well and fighting as a fairly coordinated unit. Additionally, this instinctive understanding of warfare only grows as they get older, so really old Sauruses, and Sauruses too, as far as we know, cannot die of old age, and having their minds solely focused on warfare from their first breath, well, they're pretty goddamn good at it. And lastly, you have the Kroxigors. Now, the Kroxigors serve a bit more of a dual purpose within Lizardman's society than the Sauros, simply because the Kroxigors, in addition to being excellent frontline warriors, are also the heavy lifters and the builders of Lizardman's society. Well, builders is a little bit misleading. The skinks will take care of the planning and, designing part, but the Kroxigors will do all of the heavy lifting, putting rocks upon rocks, etc. The Kroxigors are remarkably stupid, even by Sauros standards, and, well, without a skink priest telling them what to do, they're more likely to just stand around, being confused and generally docile creatures, rather than actually, doing work. Additionally, there are some slight problems with using them as frontline troops, because, well, they have precisely zero understanding of battlefield tactics, and their understanding of weaponry basically comes down to, well, I've got a giant club literally chained to my hand so that I can't drop it, might as well use it. Because if they weren't chained to their hands, well, they wouldn't really know what to do with them, would simply throw them away, and just lay into the enemy with tooth and claw instead, which, while relatively effective, a 1.5-ton bronze club is still a little bit more, impactful. Now, as I don't really have that much of an actual society to discuss on, I'll touch briefly upon how the Lizardmen army works in the lore video here instead of the army video, because, well, then I can use some more time of rambling on about the unique units. The Lizardmen army are a remarkably disciplined force, considering the fact that, well, they are made up primarily of, well, stupid-as stones animals. But they are really, really dumb animals with really, really good generals who are very, very used to commanding idiots. And while complicated military maneuvers are probably beyond them in most cases, they are perfectly able to form up a decent triple-line offensive-defensive formations, and hold said formation in actual battle. In battle, the Lizardmen primarily focus on melee combat, since they have some truly amazing core infantry units, primarily made up of Sauros warriors, who can go toe-to-toe with pretty much anything short of properly kitted out Chaos warriors. And while they don't have much of a selection in the ways of ranged units, they do have some basic ranged units. For example, the Skinks, being excellent skirmishers, have access to tons of poisoned weaponry, short bows, blowpipes, javelins, that kind of stuff. And they've also trained some of the creatures of the Lustrian jungles to fight on their behalf, like they will ride big-ass triceratopses, and force these poison-spitting little lizard things to, well, spit poison at the enemy as a form of a ranged attack. And, of course, having access to the most powerful mages in the Warhammer world, they have no shortage of magical artillery. Even the lowest of the Slann classes, one of the 4th or 5th generation Slanns, will outclass even the best wizards of any other race. Even the High Elves cannot actually match the Slanns. And they're able to choose from any of the 8 lores of magics, so they are incredibly flexible. And additionally, they have access to a 9th lore, the lore of high magic, which is a essentially unique lore. Well, the High Elves have some parts of it, but it's essentially a really powerful school of magic that is extremely limited in its use because, well, it's powerful. But, as I have said, there are very, very few Slanns left alive, and as such, in tabletop they are redonkulously expensive when it comes to points. So unless your army is absolutely massive, you're only ever going to be having like one of these things. Like in tabletop, if you have 2 full stacks of like 40 units total, you might have 2 of them, but that's probably about it. However, that's not all the Lizardmen have when it comes to magical firepower. They also have the Skinks priests. And while they're nowhere near as good as the Slanns, they're still comparable to or better than most other mages. And while they are restricted to the lore of beasts or heaven, those are by no means bad schools of magic, and as such they are an extremely effective and massively cheaper alternative to a full-on Slann mage. The basic strategy of the Lizardmen army is essentially to harass the enemy with skirmishing units, engage him in melee with superior melee units and big-ass Kroxigors to break their lines, while harassing the flanks continuously with skirmishes, and then taking care of any particular large threats by hurling repeated fireballs in their face, essentially. It's a pretty interesting army to play, and they're very, very reliable because of their special rule cold-blooded, as well they're all reptiles. They don't panic easily, and so they don't run away much. And the sheer amount of magical firepower they've got available to them pretty much makes up for the fact that they have very, very, very little to essentially none proper ranged units. So you are really forced to play somewhat offensive with the army, simply because if you just sit there, you're gonna get shot to pieces. As well, the skinks are pretty damn good skirmishers, and they're relatively accurate with their poisoned weapons and can do quite a lot of damage. They're simply not going to be able to stand up to massed units of archers or crossbowmen or whatever. And they're also relatively slow. Well, relatively slow. They have some really, really damn powerful cavalry, but most of them, the vast majority of their army, are on foot, and as such cannot be relied upon to always get the charge. However, intelligent use of skinks to slow down the enemy and to redirect their charges will often allow a cunning Lizardman player to get the charge regardless, and thereby get the most out of his very, very angry dinosaurs. And of course, the final reason you'd want Lizardmen in a Total War game is the simple fact that, while their playstyle is plenty interesting with magical artillery and infantry-based combat with very little ranged units, they simply just look awesome. I mean, they're dinosaurs. Why wouldn't you want an army of dinosaurs wielding bronze weapons and throwing around giant-ass fireballs? I mean, come on. You'd want that, of course. Then you can even throw in some proper dinosaurs along the lines of stegodons and velociraptors, just to top off the cool meter. Now, I hope I'll see you for the next army video, which will be coming fairly shortly once you get this video. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.